So I wonder to what extent he's just a fantastic storyteller. To Jeff's point of him, placing his characters so firmly in a sense of place and community, and his use of detail in songwriting. I wonder if this question of sort of his political perspective is sort of ancillary to his role as an artist, of just sort of reflecting back to his society and culture who we are at any given moment.
Well, I think, in the same way John Steinbeck was a storyteller, but his music, his writings came with a very distinct and very powerful political subtext. And I think Springsteen probably, sees himself in that same tradition. I mean, obviously, he's been so deeply influenced by Steinbeck, and it's kind of, that movie of The Grapes of Wrath was sort of a mission, became kind of, I think, the core of his identity as a writer. That those ideas and the way that Steinbeck sort of told those stories was, very, very influential on the writing that he would go on to do, and I think that I think that the politics and the storytelling are sort of are linked. It's inextricable that they, that he tells these stories. I mean, he's pushed forward by, a very powerful sense of political sense of why these characters are who they are and what put them in that position, and that those are our political issues.
They're political issues, but I don't think he sits down to write a political song. I mean, I think
he does.
I think he's writing stories, and that they have intense political content.
But
he's writing.
If you go back to the Tom Joad album, I mean, that's like the only rock and roll record that comes with a syllabus. He lists the various things that he'd been reading and the things that sort of fed into the songs. And I think it's a very common experience for him. I mean, he talks specifically about reading magazine articles or articles in the LA Times, and then being influenced. And I think that those things would call to him in one way, shape, or form, or make him angry or make him sad, and then he would write a song, write about characters that basically flowed straight out of those stories, newspapers or essays.
Sure, I totally agree, but I think we're conflating politics and art in a way that ought not to be conflated. That he's making art out of that has political implications, but I don't.
I think it's an interesting point, and if you watch his VH1 Storytellers performance, and Jeff, you might be thinking of this. For example, he played "Devils and Dust" there, which is a pretty overtly political song, and he broke it down line by line for the audience and explained sort of the subtext and everything that was in each line. But he insisted at the end of it that he was not thinking of any of that when he wrote the song, and so I wonder to what extent it is a conscious attempt to make some sort of political statement, or is he just inhabiting the characters that are then living and speaking their lives through these songs?
Well, Eric, what do you think? I mean, my position is I'm more interested in what Eric has to say than what I have to say, but but my position is that those things he may not have been sitting down with a piece of paper that had specific political ideas that he was checking off as he was writing these things. But I think when you get to that kind of behind the music kind of art, self a deconstruction, you're basically tracing your own thoughts, the roots of the thoughts. But I think that he was feeling all those things, if not necessarily thinking in terms of line by line. But Eric, what do you think?
I think that's basically true. I think he, he reads a lot. He's self-educated, but he's a voracious reader. I remember the Atlantic one time they took a photograph of his studio and they named all the books he was reading, and they were actually pretty good books. But I think he reads a story in a newspaper or a magazine and then tries to give it a human context. And then he discovers that he feels strongly about it. If you look at his, I think I agree with Jefferson here that you need to separate, at least I think this is what Jefferson is saying, you need to separate his explicit political involvement from his art. he hasn't been that involved in politics. When he appeared at No Nukes, in the program he didn't say a word. Everyone else made a statement against nuclear power, and Bruce's pages were blank except for photographs. He then appeared a few years later with Bonnie Raitt and Jackson Browne at a benefit for something called the Christic Institute, which my guess is he probably came to regret because they were some crazy people.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't see him doing anything explicitly politically until he appeared with Jesse Jackson in California at a rally against, what was that law called, that immigration law?
Prop 197, was it?
Yeah. So he appeared there, and that was really the very first time you ever saw Bruce Springsteen. Oh no, there was the No Nukes rally in Central Park also. But again, he didn't say a word. He just showed up as a guest at Jackson Browne. Then he did appear and spoke at this rally, which was consistent with the Ghost of Tom Joad. So he learned through his art how he felt, and then he felt he had a voice about it. Then you get to Kerry and Obama, and at that point, and I think it's quite explicit, he's spending some of the capital that he's been building. And he says, okay, there's a very clear difference in the direction of this country, and maybe I'll offend some people, and maybe I won't. And he gets more and more political, but still, it's not that easy to find it in the music. The Wrecking Ball is probably his most explicitly political album. And then I would say, and I would throw this back out, his relationship with Tom Morello implies a great deal more of that, because Morello is incredibly political. All those people that Jeff doesn't like Steve Earle, and I think it's a little unfair to say that Phil Oakes hasn't done much lately.
I like Steve.
He's more like them. He's all about the politics in the song, and Bruce is in love with the guy. So I'm wondering if you think that augurs more sort of newsy type politics in Bruce's music.
Yeah, my message on this is simple. I think when he sits down to write a song, he is thinking about making you feel a certain way, not vote a certain way. And in that way, like Tom Morello is his alter ego. He's writing a song to make you vote or protest. He doesn't probably even believe in voting that much, but so it's simply, I think we do a disservice to see his art as a political instrument. It is, but it's art first, and that's what's fantastic about Bruce Springsteen. It's just great art.
Yeah, but I still think, if you're, I guess it depends on how you define politics and how art and writing fits into that sort of thing. I mean, I think it's, somebody once was talking about Jackson Browne's explicitly political stuff as being, tremendously flawed. In a way, you could say his heart's in the right place, or he's got good values or whatever. But on the other hand, he writes about it in a way that one writer described as, you can basically see him, he's got like a pointer and a map, and he's talking about troop movements through Nicaragua. Whereas, Springsteen's work, maybe makes a lot of the same points, and other writers as well, but telling them in the terms of human experience and stories. But I think that there's still something very political in saying, that Magic record, for instance, you can go through song by song on that album from 2007, and you can see these songs. I mean, they work on so many levels. I think it's one of his most underrated records in a lot of ways, because you get to a song like Your Own Worst Enemy. And it's essentially, you can see that song, is he talking about a kind of a flawed lover, or is he speaking specifically, to George W. Bush and that administration? The whole idea of, your own worst enemy has come to town, and it's you. The idea that you want to think about the grounding of the Iraq War. I mean, he's not saying these things explicitly, but when you listen to the record and you hear this line about someone who, when the truth becomes too clear, they just take down the mirrors. I mean, to me, that was a description of the Bush and Cheney, their entire sort of, international policies, particularly when it came to the Middle East. That everything they said was wrong, and everything they predicted was wrong, and the grounding for the war was a fantasy. And so instead of acknowledging it, in Cheney to this day, you just pretend that it didn't happen that way. And so I think I mean, I'm not certain. I mean, whether my perspective on that is just, me listening to it and filtering it through my own various political ideas. But I think that, it's very clear throughout that album. It's a very challenging and to my mind, a very political record.
I don't disagree, except for the part where you think it's one of his better ones.
Oh, I totally agree. I think it's his last really good album.
Magic?
And I think the album that came after that, whose name I've blocked out of my head, is probably his worst album.
Is probably what?
His single worst album.
Which one was that?
Working on a Dream.
Oh, yeah.
Working on a Dream.
Yeah.
That's a terrible album.
Yeah.
Yeah, what?
The
Can
only
I
good
ask?
song on that album is the song that wasn't supposed to be on the album, which was The Wrestler. But, so he made a lot of points there, and I agree with many of them. In defense of Jackson, I did a very long interview with Jackson in The Nation, on the Nation website, just a few months ago. It's like 6,000 words, and we talked about this issue, and we also talked about Bruce, if anyone's interested. Jackson, he would go to Central America, and he would say, this is horrible, and then he would say to himself, well, what can I do about this? Well, I'm a songwriter. I can write a song about it. So it's coming from a different place than Bruce is coming from. It reminds me a lot of the argument between Bob Dylan and Phil Oakes, and Phil Oakes desperately wanted Bob Dylan's approval, and Dylan said, you're just a journalist, and he never got it. He was very cruel to Phil Oakes, and there's no question that Dylan, obviously, he's a much greater artist, obviously, but the songs that have survived best of Phil Oakes are the ones that are the least specific. That makes sense. But Phil, again, was an activist as much as an artist, and Jackson, in that role, was also an activist as much of an artist. And Bruce is not that. A lot of the times Bruce has gotten involved in politics is because Jackson has dragged him in. And again, one time I think it was a mistake. So I think Jackson would probably agree that his best songs are not the ones that are most explicitly political. On the other hand, those are the ones that are most explicitly political, and they weren't necessarily written from the perspective of being great art, but they were written to tell people, hey, wake up and look and see, who your country's killing over there.
Right. Now, you just made my point for me, Eric. That's exactly that's the distinction I'm trying to make here. It's not that Bruce is not political, but that he is first and foremost interested in art and not politics, which makes him different from Jackson Browne or Bruce Cockburn or whoever else we want to drag into this conversation.
Well, and I think there's no question that is part of what makes Bruce such a great artist and so relatable, because it creates a space to invite listeners into the stories and lives of these characters and make revelations about perhaps some of the underlying political points that he's trying to make. On the one hand, on the other hand, I can't help but wonder if there isn't sort of a self-censorship and a self-sanitizing that is sort of endemic in our culture that says, well, if you criticize too much, too far, then you're sort of loony and you're sort of pushed to the outskirts. And obviously, Bruce is someone who cares about his career, and I wonder how much of it is self-censorship or just like Jeff is alluding to more a primary commitment to the art.
Well, you need some evidence of self-censorship, and I don't think you're going to find it. I mean, he appears to be a New Deal Democrat, and his art reflects that. What's the problem? Again, he's not a communist, Tough luck.
Well, okay, yeah. So
New Deal Democrat means anymore, but I think the sanitizing or self-censoring question is more interesting, and maybe Peter can weigh in on this a little bit, because I think he seems to be very conscious of crafting this careful notion of Bruce Springsteen on stage and not overstepping any boundaries. And I think politically, I'm willing to accept that. Musically is where that becomes a problem for me. I think he's risk averse musically. I think the Seeger sessions were one of the few places he kind of broke out and tried to break away from being Springsteen, the review show, and actually had some fun. And I think I'm less interested in politics again than sort of the creative setting in which he's in. I mean, I wish he'd go hang out in Mexico or, Eastern Europe or something and begin to imbibe some new influences because I think he's you said sanitized. I think he's a little too cautious about performing being Bruce Springsteen, performing Bruce Springsteen.
But didn't you think the songs he was throwing in on the last tour were pretty wild, like "Staying Alive" and that Lord song? And I mean, he was doing some stuff I never would have expected to hear him play.
Yeah, no, that's true.
What are your thoughts, Peter?
Well, I mean, I think, to some extent, I agree with Jeff. I mean, that there is, he's very careful about his image and about what he symbolizes, and I think that's, that began in the, in the Born in the U.S.A. moment, where I think it was a very specific, it was a very deeply considered and a very political decision to make that record as, to sound as slick as it did, because he understood that each of those songs, or the majority of those songs, had very specific political, social and somewhat political ideas that he wanted to project. This idea of the American face that wasn't the face of Ronald Reagan, and so. But they did that in order to make that more palatable for a larger group of people. They made that record more of a piece with what was happening in mainstream culture and mainstream music. And I think that worked so successfy that for the most part since then he's been very conscious of, okay, what exactly are we doing here, or where is this going, what is my purpose in this moment, and in saying this. Yeah, and I agree, it would be nice for him, to feel like he really just throws everything to the wind, but I think he actually does that, and I think he's in the process of doing that. I mean, there was, their record, it's just that a lot of that stuff doesn't necessarily get out. I think a lot of the sonic stuff that was happening in Wrecking Ball was very daring in a way. There was if you could listen to a lot of those songs, I'm sorry, the one Shackled and Drawn. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a lot of kind of Celtic meets hip hop type of beat stuff happening on that. It's a lot of it's buried a little bit in the mix. But then when you get to Rocky Ground and stuff, I mean, it's a very purposeful melding of classic and modern R&B with vague amounts of, loopy things that are sort of electronic, but also set to acoustic guitars and but also, sampled beats and stuff. That
I think that some of that Celtic and that Irish stuff, it just...
I go to the bathroom when those songs come out.
Yeah, it's just, to me, that's just sort of whiteness of a sort of almost unbearable form for him. I'm what I was thinking about as you were talking, Peter, was the risk he took.
Sort of an unbearable whiteness of being. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was thinking about the 57 channels and the LA riots. That seemed to be his biggest reach as an artist in some ways, to try and break into the black community and to have something. It didn't work, but I saw him trying there.
Well, there's a whole record of that stuff. There's a whole album that's finished from '94 that's ready to go. That's all loops and electronic type stuff. It's sort of a melding of what was then modern, hip hop and rhythm and blues and his own vibe. But blending black and white music in rhythm and blues and rock and roll is what he's been doing since day one. Certainly with the E Street Band, going back to the Bruce Springsteen Band and to some extent to Steel Mill, that's always been the forefront of his thing. I mean, and you saw that with his, starting the Wrecking Ball tour at the Apollo Theater, and bringing in, and there's always been there was a point in '74 when the E Street Band was half black and half white.
Yeah, and that's what I miss. It's the old joke that there's more black people on stage at a Springsteen show than there is in the audience.
Yeah. I always whenever I'm at a Springsteen show, I'm always looking around trying to find the African American faces. I'm just like, please, but
yeah.
What do you think constitutes his failure to connect with that population?
Well, I think it's interesting because, I mean, like you're saying, the roots of his stuff go further back than the integrated bands of the early 70s, of which there were many, but it goes all the way back to James Brown and the Black Church. I mean, Joel Dinerstein wrote an article in academic one called "The Roots of Bruce Springsteen's American Dream are in the Black Church," or something to that effect. And I really think that's true. Yet it's like the Rolling Stones. They are a blues band that sing to white people.
Well, I mean, they appeal to white people. I mean, I don't know who exactly they intend to be singing for. I think when Mick sings, he wants to sing to everyone in the universe. You know what I'm saying? I mean, he wants to appeal to everybody. And I think the same thing with Bruce. You know, he's not thinking, well, I'm gonna, like, this is for the white folks. You know, I'm watering this down. It's his blending of it. You know, then the question is, well, is that authentic? This whole notion of authenticity that never goes away. People are constantly trying to define, in one way or the other. This whole I wasn't even aware of this till the other day, but this whole modern notion, I'd be really interested to find what Eric has to think about this, but rockism versus poptimism, like this is a big philosophical divide at this point, and to some people, I guess I'd never heard of it, and I think it's absurd. But
what is that distinction, Peter? I'm not aware of that either.
I only learned about this the other day, and I was like enraged and fascinated. But then I looked around on the internets, and it turns out that people have been talking about this for a long time. Rockism is like the typical adolescent male thing of, like, if it doesn't rock, it sucks. You know, if it's not raw and you're not screaming from the bottom of your dark heart, through your alcohol and shredded voice, then you're not doing it right. Whereas the poptimists are, they rave over Beyonce and whatever Kanye's doing, whatever the most popular thing of the moment is like by definition, sort of perfect. I don't agree with either of those, and I think they're both just ridiculous, oversimplifications. But again, it comes down to that question of authenticity, and who's going to define that, and to what extent can you make those definitions according to your own tastes.
Yeah, I wasn't calling him out on authenticity. I think
I understand.
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, I actually think reaching into so there are two tap roots of American popular music, one in sort of white country idiom and one in an African American idiom, and music renews itself by tapping into one or other of those other roots, and I think Bruce has been brilliant at using that. Yeah. I think, so the blame doesn't fall on him. I think it doesn't not fall on him. It falls on all of us to say, why is popular culture so segregated if in fact it is, at least for rock and roll, less so for hip hop. Why is it so segregated of an expression? I don't know. It's one of the great puzzles of American studies, I guess, and I don't have an answer.